Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ross Garnaut. Tonight, Ross is going to address us on the topic of relations with China as a great power, and indeed it is a great power. Ross's recent work for the Rudd government and climate change is well known to all in this room, but it's in the area of Australia's relations in China that Ross has made a significant contribution throughout his entire most distinguished career. During the 80s, Ross worked as a senior economic advisor to Bob Hawke, and I think it was 85, Ross, when you moved to China as Australia's ambassador in China. Here began this enduring link and commitment to Australia's engagement in Asia. Ross has been consulted by all Australian Prime Ministers since Malcolm Fraser on matters of trade policy and Asia policy more generally. And his 1989 report for Bob Hawke, Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy, provided very much the roadmap for Australian policy and engagement over the last 2 decades. Recently, Ross was appointed as the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow and Professional Fellow in Economics at the University of Melbourne. And let me say that's great because it means that you'll be in Melbourne a bit more often, and we hope to see you a lot more often. I also wanted to acknowledge Ross's considerable contribution as a director of our organisations, and it's indeed an honour to have Ross with us as a director, and his contribution around our table, when asked, always is most valued. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Professor Ross Garnaut.
Thanks, Sid. Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to talk about China as a great power more than about our bilateral relations. The world is, including that part of the world which is China, is having some difficulty in getting its head around the idea of China as one of the two great powers. Shouldn't really be so difficult because for most of the past 2.25 millennia, China has been the great power. The first time that the parts of what are now China proper came together within one state under the Qin dynasty roughly coincided with the early stages of the rise of Rome. At the height of the Han dynasty roughly coincided with the height of the power of Rome. At that time there were two great powers in the world, and Rome was almost as extensive, populous and technologically advanced as the other one. The Roman Empire gradually disintegrated. The Chinese Empire did not. From time to time it disintegrated as a state, but was quickly brought together again, or quickly in long historical terms, and a state resumed occupation of the old territory. So most of the time since the Qin dynasty, China has been the biggest economy on earth, and for most of the time the strongest state on earth. It was certainly the biggest economy and strongest state when George III sent a friend, Earl George Macartney, as his envoy to the Emperor Qianlong in 1793, and suggested to him that there was mutual advantage in close trade and diplomatic relations. And Qianlong considered the matter. There had been a little awkwardness about Macartney's reluctance to kowtow, but when that was all over, the emperor didn't stand on his dignity. He did consider the matter and gave his considered opinion. China or Britain didn't have anything that China needed. Well, it would have been wise for the Chinese leadership to treat more respectfully the upstart power from the island to the west of Europe, because just half a century later, in 1840, when the emperor sought to exercise power over visiting British entrepreneurs and sought to stamp out the narcotics trade, the British House of Commons spent a whole night debating how they would respond. Gladstone gave what is said to be his greatest speech to the Commons at 2 o'clock in the morning, arguing that it was not a good use of Britain's rising power to defend the trade in opium. But he was a minority. It is said that Matheson and Jardine had bought half of the House. Gladstone convinced the other half, but the other half was a couple of votes short, and so the British Navy sank the Chinese fleet at Canton and made the Chinese coast safe for opium from India. 1840 probably represents about the time when British economic power, under the influence of the great scientific and technological and economic revolution that had reached considerable momentum in the late 18th century, exceeded the Chinese economic power and weight. It hadn't taken very long. China took a long time to adapt to the rising power of first Britain and then the West. It felt so secure in its own superiority that it didn't for a long time feel challenged. China was different from Japan, which was smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable. And Japanese learnt things about Chinese vulnerability, about the vulnerability of the old Sinitic world of East Asia, of which Japan was part, from China's defeat in the First Opium War. And you began from 1840 to get in Japan movements favouring accommodation with the new ways of the West, recognizing that absorption of the new knowledge, the scientific revolution, the economic revolution, the industrial revolution, was going to be necessary for the preservation of Japanese sovereignty. In Japan, people around the shogun began to make movements of accommodation, and that really occasioned what was at first a great reaction. The reaction that restored the power of the emperor, the Meiji emperor. But the Meiji Restoration was, which began as reaction against those who wanted to accommodate the new ways of the West, quickly gave way to realization by the young emperor, the Meiji emperor, and those around him that there really was no alternative to absorbing the knowledge of the West. And so the Meiji Restoration, beginning in reaction, became a radical movement of absorption, quick absorption of the productive ways of Europe. And so that destabilized the power balance in the old Sinitic world. Up until the time of the Meiji Emperor, the relationship of Japan to China was a highly respectful one, in which the Japanese emperor would correspond to the Chinese emperor in classical Chinese from a subordinate position, but a respected subordinate position. Access to the new technology quickly put Japan in a different position. And so from the 1890s, you saw rising Japanese power beginning to challenge Chinese power in the north. But still, China had difficulty coming to grips with the need to change. It had been such a successful society, economy, and polity. Well, it wasn't really until the success of the Communist Revolution that you had a considerable unanimity within the society about the need for fundamental change. There was, of course, a very big false start, dominated at first by ideas from the Soviet Union, the central planning, which turned out to be a terrible failure. And China only got onto its modern productive path after the death of Mao Zedong, when Deng Xiaoping got the numbers in the Standing Committee of the Politburo and in the Central Committee, and committed the Chinese Communist Party to opening to the outside world and to reform. At an occasion in December, I recalled the discussions I used to have with Rod Carnegie about all of this in the 70s, and I'm pleased to acknowledge that Rod, before it all happened, was more confident than I that it would happen. Well, the rest is history. China has been on what in retrospect looks an inexorable path of opening and reform since then. There hasn't been any period in which economic reforms and opening went backwards. There have been faster periods of movement forward. And there was one period when reforms were challenged, where people who felt uncomfortable about market-oriented reform used the West's reaction to the Tiananmen massacre to seek to turn back policy, but they failed, and the period from 1992 turned out to be the period of fastest movement forward into internationalizing the economy. The facts are pretty well known. Average economic growth in China since then, almost 10%, and actually fastest in the last decade, in the early 21st century, when it's averaged over 10%. Well, when a populous country grows rapidly for a long period of time, it becomes a very large economy, and that's what's happening in China. China will be the world's largest economy when its people, on average, are 1/4 as productive as the people of the United States. And the people who've had a lot of interaction with China know that there's no reason to think that the Chinese people for long would be only as 1/4 as productive as people in the United States. So in the absence of major political instability, that's unlikely but not impossible, then we're on a course towards China again being the world's largest power. The catch-up from here will proceed more rapidly than you would expect simply from extrapolating the growth numbers. And that's because China is approaching what economic historians, especially the Japanese economist Minami, have called the turning point in economic development. In the early stages of economic development in all of the East Asian economies, growth was based on an abundance of labour, and as it was export-oriented, comparative advantage was in labour-intensive goods. You had very rapid industrial growth based on exports of relatively simple manufactures using a lot of labour, and that could keep going for a considerable while as labour came in from the countryside, keeping wages relatively low, maintaining competitiveness in simple labour-intensive manufactures. Japan reached the turning point where there was no longer surplus in the labour in the countryside in the early 60s. Korea and Taiwan about 1.5 decades later. China is approaching that place now. And in those circumstances, we will go through a period of rapidly rising wages, a rising real exchange rate, and an accelerated catch-up with the most advanced economies. There's no reason to think that China's growth will slow down in the early stages of the turning point, with real wages rising, but it will be a different pattern of growth. Growth up till now, and especially the very rapid growth of the last dozen years, or the last decade, has been based on very strong export growth, very strong productivity growth, the highest investment rate and savings rate that the world has ever seen in any economy, and rising over time. Consumption levels have been rising quite rapidly, probably more rapidly than in any large economy ever, but not fast enough to absorb rising incomes. Incomes have grown faster, and the wage share of income has been falling. The profit share rising. Most of the profits are saved and reinvested. The investment share has been rising. But even the rise in consumption and the rising investment together hasn't been enough to absorb the growth in production. And so you've had these huge and growing current account surpluses. It was those current account surpluses that funded the debt-driven booms in the United States, Australia, Britain and Spain in particular during the early 21st century, which were the precursor to the great crash of 2008. Well, people say China's got to spend more on, got to consume more to reduce those surpluses, but the one thing that will reduce the surpluses is rising wages as labour becomes scarce. And that's starting to happen. It will accelerate over the next few years. That will shift income from profits to wages. Consumption will rise. Investment will fall. And the pattern of growth will change. But we'll probably see an acceleration of what economists call total factor productivity growth, the overall productivity of the economy, because rising wages will force more efficient use of resources. Productivity growth has been extremely high in China and actually rising through the 80s. Completely different story to the Soviet Union right through its history, and different from a lot of other parts of East Asia. But that high productivity growth will probably accelerate as wages rise, and we'll get economic growth coming more from productivity growth than from capital accumulation. Well, the growth of China has seen a gradual shift in global power, because strategic weight is closely associated with economic weight. They don't stay wide apart for very long. Temporally, you can have a large divergence between strategic weight and economic weight. There was a considerable period when the Soviet Union had much more military weight than it had economic weight, but societies and economies that overemphasize military investment end up not being able to carry the economic load. So there are strategic implications of continued rapid economic growth. The great crash of 2008, and I tell this story as well as the story of Earl George Macartney and Emperor Qianlong in the book The Great Crash of 2008, Melbourne University Press last year. The Great Crash has left a legacy of a seriously weakened Europe and has seriously weakened the United States. Debt crippled, budgetary problems as far ahead as one can see, tepid economic growth at best, whereas the crisis has left economic growth in China and other big Asian countries, India and Indonesia, are relatively undisturbed. So the tectonic movements we've been seeing over the last several decades have been greatly accelerated. We're moving towards a quadrupolar world in which there are four great powers, if one of them only if it gets its act together, all of whose compliance will be necessary in making anything work in the international system. And those four emerging great powers are China, the United States, India, and what I think will inevitably be a more integrated European Union, although it doesn't look like that at the moment. And it will be a world that doesn't work unless these four entities are broadly agreeing on the directions of international cooperation, and there will be two greater powers within that four, the United States and China. We've already had a couple of examples of trying to make the world work in this new power structure, and it's very difficult. We've all got a lot of learning to do. The Chinese, let alone the Indians, are not used to the idea that what they do has a huge influence on the whole world system. They haven't brought up generations of people thinking about their role in the world and the crucial international implications of their decisions, the sort of thinking that goes on at Harvard and Yale and Columbia. There's no history of that yet in China. It will come. And in the United States and in the West, there's a lot of thinking to be done about how this new world will work. We haven't worked it out, and so the world is not working very well. A couple of examples. The global monetary system. The huge imbalances that emerged in the lead up to the Great Crash, I say in the book, are one of four causes of the Great Crash, four parts of the elephant, I call them, and they were probably essential conditions to it, but not necessary conditions for the crash. But the surpluses began to emerge when the United States set upon a course of greatly increased budget deficits and high levels of general borrowing. It did this with fighting a couple of wars without raising taxes to pay for them, at the same time giving large tax cuts. In a way, a version of the destabilization of the United States economy that occurred during the Johnson presidency, except Johnson didn't give tax cuts. It happened that there was a source of funding available for that, the East Asian surpluses, and over time increasingly the Chinese surpluses. And China responded to that opportunity. Chinese surpluses had not been particularly large before the early 21st century, but the opportunity of the huge American deficits opened to them, and they piled in. And on the eve of the crisis, China's current account surplus was 11% of GDP. Well, these imbalances had instability written into them. The huge levels of debt that developed in the United States, and within China, the poor use of capital for a lot of purposes for which it was needed, but it would have required close cooperation between the two for either of them to have got off that path once they were on it. If the United States unilaterally had decided to tighten budgets, to reduce expenditure, raise taxes, get its fiscal affairs in order, then if there'd been no response from China, you would have had global recession. And if China alone had sought to expand expenditure without an adjustment in the United States, you would have had rising interest rates, a destabilization of the Western financial system more severe than that which actually occurred. They actually had to get together and agree on these things, and there was never productive discussion. We still haven't got our act together on that. I sat next to Zhou Xiaochuan, the governor of the People's Bank of China, at the Reserve Bank's 50th birthday dinner last week, and he was expressing to me his concern that if America went back to expansionary ways, was able to find a way to continue to fund government deficits, then China would be tempted to go back to its export-oriented ways. Another example is climate change. China and the United States are by far the world's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, and China by far the most rapidly growing emitter of greenhouse gases. There's going to be no global solution without cooperation between the two of them, and we saw at Copenhagen that we haven't yet begun to find a basis for cooperation in this new world. Well, for us, the adjustment to China as a great power is a very difficult one. The period of white settlement in Australia roughly coincides with the period in which English-speaking people dominated the seas, and from about 1840, the world. We are used to having, as a protector, as a big brother, the toughest, strongest boy on the block. And that's led us into certain habits of mind which will need some adjustment in the new world. When Russia ran into Britain in the Crimea in 1863, the Sydney Morning Herald ran an editorial, "We warn the Tsar," that when the Tsar is the largest economy on earth, then we will need to be more clever and more subtle to achieve strategic objectives. What will China be like as a great power? Well, China is used to being a great power, and for Chinese it will feel like a return to the normal order of things. They will feel quite comfortable about it. China will actually be less scratchy, but it won't be very sensitive. It will be rather arrogant. It was always thus with great powers.